Shadow Minister Michael Shanks.
Thank you very much, Mr Mundell, and it's a pleasure to participate in this debate under your chairmanship and to speak in a debate brought by my neighbour, the Honourable Member for Glasgow South. And I congratulate him on bringing this debate. He and I have endured many electoral scrapes before we got to this place. But this is actually the first opportunity we've had to participate in a debate at the same time, and so it's a pleasure. And it is a timely debate because, as we've already heard, over the past few weeks, the government does seem to be trying to give the impression that everything's okay, that there's nothing to see here. We're back to normal, the cost of living doesn't exist, and everybody all across the country is getting on just fine. And I thought the member for Glasgow South made the point really importantly about this cost of living absolutely affecting individuals, but also affecting the very fabric of our society, and I'll come back to that point later on. I know from my own constituency casework and from meetings with community groups and others, and I know it will be the same for all of us, that this cost of living crisis is far from over. In fact, people are now struggling perhaps more than ever. So it is important we keep talking about living standards, and important we push the government for the hopefully for the weeks that it has left in office to do more. This Parliament is on record to be the first in modern history where living standards in the country will actually contract. Household income growth is down by more than 3% in a Parliament, and Britain is worse off. And I was interested by the Honourable Lady from Dover's reflections on history, and I think it was a really interesting perspective to bring. I did think at one point the praising of Bevan might have led to another faction in the Conservative Party, the Bevanites on the other side. But I think it was a really important point, and particularly I'm going to take away to think about the idea of a unified department looking at the issues, because she makes the point very well. And just a few weeks ago I raised the issue of prepayment meters in the Chamber, and it's a classic example of actually quite a straightforward issue, but the various bodies that deal with it are divided and at different parts of the system, and I think bringing them together would be a very helpful suggestion. I mentioned before that the cumulative impact of the cost of living, and I think that's really important because we see levels of poverty and destitution reaching horrifying levels. People who were already teetering on the brink of poverty have now been plunged into it and into destitution. Inflation may be coming down, but the aftershocks are certainly still being felt. Wages have not kept pace with costs. Debt is rising across many, many households. And that ability to make the pay packet stretch just a little bit further every month is becoming more and more difficult, if not impossible. We saw this week that even the member for Mid-Norfolk had to confront mortgage challenges on a salary of $118,000, some 4 times the average salary of a worker in my constituency, still not allowing him to continue in his job, although I suspect there would be a huge outpouring of grief in that case. But more than 1 million households are expected to, this year, come to the end of cheaper mortgage deals, leading to an average increase in annual housing costs of about £1,800, according to the Resolution Foundation. And yesterday, the leader of the Labour Party, the member for Holborn and St Pancras, raised the case of an Iceland worker and was met with derision by many members on the opposite benches. And I've had dozens of similar cases raised with me over the past few months. Constituents who were already stretched to afford a mortgage in the first place, now finding themselves in greater debt. Income no longer matching the mortgage payments that they could only just about afford before. Citizens Advice has done some research on this and found that mortgage holders, on average, before had around £61 left after paying for essential, and now, after these mortgage changes, find themselves more than £100 at least in debt every month, a cumulative impact, and some cases 4, 5, 6 times that amount. And of course, part of the problem is still the rising cost of food. Although inflation overall may have come down, the food inflation continues to be a huge problem for families. The overall price of food rose by 26% last year, which is a staggering figure. And of course, we also have the slightly more subtle version of inflation by companies simply reducing the product that they're selling, which puts even more pressure on families. And energy bills have soared, with people struggling to heat their homes, and we've heard from other members. A quarter of adults last year said that they were occasionally, hardly ever, or never able to keep themselves comfortably warm, which is a basic that any of us should expect. 34% of adults said they cut back on their heating, and 16% of adults said they were worried that food would run out and they couldn't afford more. That's a staggering statistic. Many of us may have visited the Trussell Trust's event in Parliament yesterday, and I spoke to a number of people who raised examples of families who were in work, in well-paid, in permanent jobs, and were still struggling to make ends meet. And we know that for more and more people in the economy, that's not the situation, so they're in an even worse position. Working-age adults are far more likely to turn to food bank, and almost half of households experiencing food insecurity are disabled, which is an issue I want to return to. It's a picture of a country of so many people teetering on the brink of poverty and now living such a precarious life that even work isn't lifting them out of poverty. And a number of members have raised this issue of the intergenerational nature of poverty, of the challenge of a generation growing up now without any of the expectations of a previous generation. Before I was elected to this place, I was a high school teacher, and I saw many of those young adults, very well qualified, very intelligent, very capable, leaving school, going off to university or to work, with none of the expectations that they would be able to get a permanent job and afford a home. It just doesn't exist for many of them now. And the fact that so many of them have resigned themselves to that fact is in itself depressing. So in the midst of all of this, we have a government, I'm hoping the Minister will correct me on this, but a Minister that seems to suggest that everything is fine, that there's nothing to see here. The fact is the economy is not working for working people across this country. We've had 14 years now of a Conservative government, and people are certainly no better off than they were before. We've got higher taxes, higher mortgage payments, and prices still rising at the shops. 25 tax rises in this Parliament alone. Households paying, on average, £4,000 more in tax each year. The Conservatives have become the party of high tax because they are the party of low growth. And the same is true in Scotland, where we also see tax rises in Scotland to cover for fiscal mismanagement, a £1.5 billion black hole, but also for a lack of growth, which I attribute to both Scotland's governments. So we need to get some basic economic competence back so that we can boost wages, bring down bills, and make working people in all parts of our country better off. I knew that would prompt something. I'll give way to the member for Glasgow South.
I'm glad the honourable gentleman talks about economic competence. When the Scottish Labour leader described removing the cap on bankers' bonuses as economically incompetent, he went further. He said it was economically illiterate and morally bankrupt. Was he right or wrong?
Well, the leader of the Scottish Labour Party, my good friend Anas Sarwar, is always right. And of course, we did oppose the lifting of the cap at the time. What we've outlined since is that this, at the moment, is not the moment to bring it back. But we've said very clearly that bankers should be on notice, that if we have the behaviour that led to it in the first place, it would be very easy to implement it again. Does the member? Yeah, absolutely.
Can I just ask him, does he accept the independent evidence of the OBR, which says that, and I can share the evidence with him if he wishes, that the majority of people in Scotland pay less tax than they would if they lived in England, including council tax? And his concerns about his remarks about tax make me wonder, does he now no longer support what was on his leaflets when he won the by-election, that council tax should be frozen?
Well, I'm grateful for the member from Ayrshire, North Ayrshire and Arran, first of all, for her dedication in checking my leaflets and retaining that information. Clearly, I think that's what we call cut-through in the political world. But also, I think it is an interesting point. I mean, I do accept the point, and she has on a number of occasions questioned the government on the point. But I do think there is an issue that when someone on £28,500 is paying more tax, these are not wealthy people. And in the midst of what we've all talked about in this debate, that is increasing the cost of living. I think on the council tax, I feel like I'm relitigating a by-election that I thought was maybe behind me for now, but I opposed the proposal of a 25% increase in council tax, which was in the consultation by the Scottish Government. There's a world of difference. There's a world of difference between 25% and a council tax freeze, which is going to hammer communities all across Scotland. And of course, she's very aware of my leaflets, but I'm not sure any of her party were aware that the First Minister was going to announce that policy before he announced it, which shows just how little thought went into it. But to get back to Labour's New Deal for working people, which I thought the interventions were going to be about, we've made it very clear that in the first 100 days of a Labour government, we want to introduce the strongest commitment to improving the life of workers in a generation, raising wages, improving working conditions, bringing stability back to employment and enshrining workers' rights on day one, which will undo the damage of much of the anti-worker legislation we've seen over the past 14 years. We've also set out how we'll bring down energy bills by building cheaper, cleaner power across the country through the creation of GB Energy, headquartered in Scotland, something I'm sure my colleagues from Scotland will warmly welcome, in a publicly owned clean generation company. And we'll look to reform things like work capability processes, which I've raised in this Parliament on a number of occasions, so that people who are entitled to benefits are not locked out of them by a bureaucracy that simply doesn't work. I want to return briefly to the comments from the member for Glasgow South and the member for North Ayrshire and Dover around this intergenerational question, because I think it's incredibly important. I spoke about when I was a teacher, but before that I worked for a charity that worked with young people involved in gangs and offending. And the route out of that was often giving people something to aspire to, giving people a sense of hope that their future would be better than the poverty and destitution they found themselves in. And it seems to me that increasingly we are turning our back on a generation of young people who have done nothing to cause any of the crises that they're currently facing, but are going to pay the price for a long time to come. And on the issue of disability, very briefly, and I draw attention to my register of interests, as I'm a trustee of 2 disability charities, disabled people face higher costs of living right across the board. Scope found that disability-related costs are the equivalent of 63% of a disabled person's income. So just by having a disability, you're already at a disadvantage financially. And of course, the cost of living crisis has exacerbated that hugely. And I want to mention a woman I met just before Christmas who was forced out of her home because she couldn't afford to heat it anymore. She'd spent the past 3 months living in the living room with a hospital bed where she ate her meals, where she had her personal care, where she spent most of the day because it was the only room in her home that she could heat properly. And the downside was the rest of her house became infected with damp and mould because she couldn't turn the heating on at all. She'd been failed on a number of levels by the benefit system, by cuts to her care package, by rising energy bills and food bills and everything else. And she also lost the opportunity to continue in her employment programme, which was what gave her opportunity in life. There are countless examples of this. I'm sure every single one of us could recount an example from our constituents. And we should be ashamed that in 2024, in a country as rich as ours, this is the standard of living people are living through. So I want to close by saying what the member for Glasgow South started by saying, that this fall in living standards is a huge crisis facing our country, affecting mental and physical health, affecting education, affecting family well-being, housing, employment, a whole range of issues. It's not going away, it's not declined, it's not somehow getting better. It will stalk families for years to come, possibly for a generation to come. Debt is piling up to eye-watering levels, and with it comes the impact on families. The government has failed in basic economic tests, and working people, as always, are the ones who pay the price. So can I thank the member for Glasgow South for bringing this important debate, and I look forward to hearing what the Minister is going to do in the few weeks the government has left, perhaps, to change this for families across the country. Thank you.